Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us for the webinar this evening, which has been hosted by AHDB. My name is Clover McKee and I'm the Knowledge Transfer Officer for Beef and Lamb. And tonight we'll be discussing how to use Clover to drive performance whilst reducing nitrogen inputs. Our presenters this evening are Helen Mathieu from Germinal and Siwan Howatson from AHDB. Helen has worked as an area sales manager for Germinal for 15 years, and Siwan works at AHDB as a grass and forest scientist. So the plan of action for this evening is that Helen will take us through a 35-minute presentation, and then we'll swap over to Siwan for a 5-minute presentation on how to use the recommended grass and clover list. You will all be muted throughout the webinar, but if you would like to ask a question, then please type it into the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. When Helen and Siwan have finished presenting, I can ask your questions. If you can't see the questions box, please click on the orange arrow to open it up, and then click on the drop down and you'll see where you can type in your question. You can type in your question at any time throughout the webinar. And please also use this box to let us know if you're having any technical problems, and we'll do our best to help. So there's over 450 people registered for the webinar this evening. So hopefully there won't be any technical difficulties tonight, but please bear with us if there are any. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Helen for this evening's webinar.
Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody, and thank you for listening. And it's great to be involved with AHDB on behalf of Germinal. I can say that, and we're very pleased to be working very much with farmers on this level and building the discussions and helping farmers overcoming some of the issues on farm and helping some of the improvements to farming systems. So tonight it's red and white clover. I'll be looking at the characteristics and benefits and some management tips. So first of all, I thought it would be worth to just talk about the advantages of clover generally, red and white clover. There are a range of many forage proteins which we can integrate into different farming systems to help reduce costs, improve performance, provide traceable homegrown protein, and potentially at the same time reducing carbon footprints. And some of these crops are some of the oldest and most widely used forages worldwide, things such as lucerne's, another legume that we might use. But most livestock farmers should be able to produce good yields of homegrown forage protein, either in crop rotations or in longer term grasslands. So the advantages of clover, well, nitrogen fixation, nitrogen from the atmosphere, the bacteria in the root nodules convert that to nitrate, and that's then released for the companion crop and the following crops. Root systems of red and white clover help to open up the soil, so the taproot and the network of stolons in the white clover, improving the overall soil organic matter and soil structure and fertility. Both clovers are high in D value, in mineral. Oops, sorry, clicked over already. Sorry about that. So both clovers are high in minerals and true protein, and the clovers pass through the rumen more quickly than grasses, so they have what we call higher intake potential, which results in improved animal performance. So it's a source of totally homegrown forage protein, and importantly now, the reduced greenhouse gas impact. So not only are you reducing your reliance on manufactured nitrogen, you're also reducing your carbon footprint, by improving your output and reducing your inputs. So that can further help with your your carbon footprint. Both legumes, they have that sort of waxy leaf. They're both like warmer soil, so they're very productive in a drought. And also, more importantly, nowadays we have the to think of the pollinators and the other environmental benefits of using these sorts of species, and they're a very valuable source of nectar for insects. So starting with red clover, so you can see the taproot there on the left, and that obviously, that's the picture of the taproot that we were just talking about there. So it's grown mainly for conservation. It has very high yields, typically 10 to 15 tons of dry matter per hectare. So it's an ideal high protein silage for cattle and sheep. It can be grown also in mixed swards or in monocultures, so it does tend to have a lower grazing tolerance than white clover, although it is capable of excellent aftermath grazing for finishing lambs. Nitrogen fixing, we've frequently quoted this 150 to 200 kgs of nitrogen per hectare, and typically 75 to 100 kgs of that would be transferred to the companion crops. To be aware that the red clover particularly is high in plant hormones, so those are phytoestrogens, and they can cause a hormonal disturbance in ewes. They can affect ewe fertility, but also those phytoestrogens, it's important to realise they are perhaps also one of the constituents that will influence lamb live weight gain, for example. Red clover particularly is high in an enzyme called polyphenol oxidase, which protects the protein, which means the protein passes through the rumen, and the more of it is available to the animal for the animal to utilize. So it stops the protein breakdown. And red clover, it's been shown to improve milk yields, affect live weight gain, and also has an impact on ewe condition. So it's a truly traceable form of homegrown protein. As we've already said, it's a soil fertility builder. So persistency, here you can see the crown of the plant. So all the new growth literally comes out from that crown. So it's it can be vulnerable to grazing damage. Traditionally, red clover sort of had a persistency of around 2 to 3 years, so it was grown for around 2 to 3 harvests, and the older varieties would start to die out. So it wasn't economically, financially viable to keep the crop in for any longer than that. But breeding has considerably improved the crown survival, and now we have modern clovers that do last for 3, 4, and 5 years. So the main threat to the red clover are the pest and diseases. So the pests are stem nematode, and the disease is the main disease is sclerotinia, which is a fungal disease, and the soil-borne pathogens. So it's important to use red clover in rotations to potentially break down, the soil pathogens that could come and cause damage to that plant. So it's important to grow it in rotation. So red clover, we've got a taproot and we've got a crown. And another little identification tip for you there, I don't know whether you can see on that picture, those red clover leaves, and they're sort of slightly furry, slightly hairy. So if you can't find, or you haven't got time to look down and try and find the taproot or a stolon for a white clover, that's a quick way to check. The vast majority of the time, if it's got a furry leaf like that, it's going to be a red clover plant. So looking at the nutritional composition, a comparison here between average grass silage and an average red clover silage. Perhaps this is a dairy average from the dairy sector, where beef and sheep might be sort of slightly higher dry matter and maybe slightly lower D value, because they'd be cutting at sort of slightly later in the year, where the D value would be slightly lower and dry matter slightly higher, as the grass would be through to a later growth stage. But typically a range of 28 to 30, around that 30 for red ryegrass silage, and the red clover silage is fairly similar, so 25 to 30. D values, high 60s, low 70s for ryegrass, and not that dissimilar again for red clover. Therefore, we get an ME of 10.9 to 11.5, or maybe just under 10 to 11.5 for red clover. What I do want to draw your attention to, though, is the crude protein. So ruminant protein requirements and feed protein supplies are generally expressed in terms of CP, of crude protein. That includes the non-protein nitrogen, i.e. any free nitrogen that's hanging around, as well as any true protein. So rumen degradable protein, that describes the protein supply available to the rumen microbes. Typically, that is rapidly degradable, and as much as 70% of it can be lost to the environment. While the DUP, the digestible undegraded protein, so that's the true protein, and that's the protein that's available from the feed that escapes rumen degradation, and it's therefore available to the animal. So CP levels in the analysis look similar, but the protein in the red clover is actually true protein, or DUP, and it's available to the animal, which is why we see increases in intake and animal performance, whereas the protein levels we read here might look fairly similar. Here's some results from some work that was done at IBERS comparing red clover silage, lucerne silage and ryegrass silage is being fed to ewes. These ewes were all bearing twins, and it was a 6-week feeding experiment. And the ewes were adapted for a period of 2 weeks, and then they went into the 6 weeks of feeding program. So a group of ewes grazing lucerne, a group grazing lucerne silage, a group grazing red clover silage, and a group grazing ryegrass silage. You can see the ewe weight at the start of the trial in the first line there. So ewe weights on the lucerne 71.9 kgs, red clover 73.1, and ryegrass 69.7. And the line beneath that, you can see the live weight gain that the ewes achieved over that 6-week period. So on the lucerne silage, they put on just over 11 kilos. On the red clover, they put on just over 2 kilos. And then on the ryegrass, they put on 6.5 kilos. And you can see, obviously, from that, the subsequent impact that had on body condition score, where the red clover silage, the ewes gained the best condition score as well. Litter weight, so the combined weight of the lambs, not a great deal of variation there, sort of 9.4, 9.9, and 9.5. But importantly, the most significant thing is the lamb weight after turnout, so 12 weeks after birth. Now they were all, once they were born, the lambs were born, and ewes and lambs were all turned out. And at that 12-week weight, you can see that significant improvement in the lamb live weight is still evident on the lambs whose mothers had been eating the red clover silage. Okay. Moving on now to management, some of the successful establishments. So much of this will be very similar for both the red and white clover. Both are reasonably versatile. They can be established quite easily in a variety of ways. Can be undersown in a spring cereal or late summer after cereal, introduced into existing swards, can be overseeded or slot seeded to improve a sward. So you know, all systems can produce very good results with different drills and different types of things. So it depends very much on your soil type, your crop rotation, and what you want to achieve on farm. There are many drills out there, and there are very methods that can be particularly successful. Oversowing, for example, into existing swards, we'd just say, as long as you're not an organic farmer, then control the weeds beforehand. And then ideally you would either sow perhaps after a silage harvest or a very, very tight grazing. Obviously, moisture is going to be dependent on moisture, so it will always be shallow drilling, and when you think we're going to get the right weather, which we don't quite know when that's going to be this year, do we? And you do need an open lay. So if you're oversowing, you need to make sure that you can see plenty of soil in the bottom there. There's no point trying to oversow it into a thick sort of thatchy grass lay. Clovers need slightly warmer soils than grass, so a minimum of 5, probably rising to 7. So around April time, depending a little bit where you are. And then if you're oversowing, it might be sort of, you know, mid-June perhaps, but then any time then from sort of say the end of July through to mid-August. And if conditions permit, then you might even be drilling to the end of August, even to the early September. So key things are that good seed to soil contact, shallow drilling, and a fine, firm and clean seed bed. I wish I had a pound for every time I said that. Right, successful establishment. Well, always we want a soil test in good time. We need to know what our pHs are and what the P and K levels are. Clover's quite sensitive to pH, so we need 6 and above. And if it needs liming, we need to make sure we've done, you know, applied lime well in advance to make sure it's worked its way through that surface layer. If we've got indexes of 2, so good soil indexes of P and K for establishment, we could be applying 50 kgs of phosphate and 150 kgs of potash per hectare at establishment. We'd only really be applying nitrogen in the spring if we were using nitrogen at all, and that would only be in low-end soils. So low-end soils are either really light, sort of sandy land, or it could be following cereals, or it could possibly be following a short-term grass lay where there's not been any muck or slurry applied. And then we'd only be applying around 50, maybe 60 kgs per hectare. And a lot of people will grow it without applied nitrogen at all, of course. Seed rates for red clover, well, clover seeds, red clover seeds about sort of 3 times as big as white clover seed. So that's why we see a much higher seed rate for red clover compared to white clover. Monocultures, not as common as the mixed species swards, but a monoculture would be looking at 15 kilos per hectare approximately of red clover seed. In mixed swards, 7.5 kilos per hectare of red clover, and that would be mixed with, say, 22 to 28 kilos of ryegrasses. And we see a lot more now of the multi-species type swards, so mixed with red clover, white clover, plantain and chicory, and probably some herbs as well. And typically there, you'd say maybe 5 to 7.5 kilos of red clover with perhaps 5 kilos of chicory and plantain, and there could be 2.5 kilos of white clover and maybe herbs in there as well, and maybe different grasses as well in there. Shallow drilling is your target always, and when we're talking about mixed swards, so red clover with ryegrass, we're looking for an established number of plants of 200 per square metre during the, well, by the first full year, the first 12 months, and that's in the sort of autumn of that year. So typically 7.5 kilos a hectare would give us between 300 and 400 seeds per square metre, and we're looking to achieve plant populations of about 200 in a mixture by the first full year of production. So nutrient requirements, well, we've been talking about nitrogen fixation. For that nitrogen fixation to take place, that's dependent on soil temperature, microbial soil health, and a good root network with plenty of nodules, sorry, whether that's on the stolons or in the hairs on the taproot. The nodules are pale coloured and fleshy, and they're quite easy to find. If you dig up some plants and gently tease away the soil, you should be able to find those nodules on the root hairs. And if they're working, they're going to be pale coloured and fleshy and soft. If they're dried out and they're dark and they're black, they're not yet working. So it's easy to test whether they're working or not. They do require a good soil pH. They will not be working in a waterlogged soil, and they require good P and K availability, as you can see there, indexes of 2 and above. Now, nutrient requirements. A ton of red clover will remove around 8 kilos of phosphate per ton of dry matter and 27 kilos of potash. So that will need replacing to keep the plant going, to keep feeding the plant. So, and that could obviously could be slurry or another source. It doesn't have to be out of a bag. So 12 tons, around 30 tons fresh weight per hectare, that would be removing 100 kilos of phosphate and over 250 kilos of potash. So I say it's important that it is replaced. So systems in practice really now. So let's not forget the importance of it all, of red clover, but all clovers to organic systems, where it's a key conservation and soil fertility building crop. Typically, as I've already said, it's undersown in the spring cereal, and it's very valuable soil improving break crop, providing nutrients and minerals. And obviously it's a very cost effective form of improving soil fertility. And similar principles really with white clover. It could also be used sometimes as green manure. So when it comes to grazing, it's mainly grazing the aftermath, maybe intensive grazing. You can see here with some chicory and plantain and ryegrass. So it's a very useful feed. Produces very large amounts of live weight gain in lambs, so it's ideal for finishing lambs at the end of the season without any compromise to carcass quality or any killing out percentages and so on. Ideally, when we're grazing, we want to make sure that we're not going to damage that crown. We've seen the crown there. We want to avoid damage, and we also want to avoid compaction to the soil. So that's going to apply particularly if it's wet ground or heavier animals, when just treading on it or grazing it too hard can actually damage the crown. Always be aware of bloat. So that's caused by an excessive buildup of gas inside the animal, which put pressure on the vital organs. And really, if you've not got, if they're not used to grazing clover, if there's not clover all over the farm, when they start grazing clover, you should limit access. Don't turn them in hungry into a clover-rich pasture and feed fibre or hay, or turn them out with fibre. And particularly towards the mid and late season on damp mornings, you should be particularly careful of a bloat at that time. Obviously, there's things like bloat guard and anti-bloat additives that you can offer. And as we've also said, that the plant is high in these phytoestrogens, which will affect yew fertility. It should be temporary, and with a change of diet, they will overcome it. But persistent access to red clover for yews can cause damage to the reproductive organs. But the simple rule of thumb is do not feed red clover to yews 6 weeks either side of mating, and that's both grazing and red clover silage. There's no effect, or there's no effect been according on rams, and very little work that shows that there's any evidence that affects cattle either. So conservation, so after the year of establishment, or maybe in the year of establishment rather, grazing lightly. If there's a problem with annual weeds, it might be topping them, or if it's been sown earlier, harvesting will be the preferred way to remove any annual weeds. Or it could be grazed, being careful not to graze it, to overgraze it, to graze it too hard. But that first winter, you don't really want to go into it with too much, growth, too much leaf on. So grazing heights coming into the overwintered stubble at the beginning of winter, probably down to around 6 centimetres. Usually between 3 to 5 cuts per year, and at 6 to 8 week intervals, down to a cutting height of 7 centimetres in this instance. So we've seen the crown, and by cutting too low, you'll be cutting into that new growth. So we need to make sure that we're not actually cutting it too low. Crown survival is the key to persistency, as we've already said. Now, traditionally, we always said, 50% flowering was your guide to when you actually start cutting red clover. But a recent project that Germinal were involved with, along with IBERS, we're studying the optimum cutting growth stage, the cutting equipment, and wilting and ensiling. So, say traditionally we'd be going at 50% flower, but well, in actual fact, the optimum time, the best yield and quality, is at the very early flower bud stage. So you may be starting to see a few flowers, but it's really early flower bud stage, not when it's 50% in flower. So as the yield increases and the plant matures, but once it starts flowering, the ME and protein are starting to decline. So the increasing maturity, you're going to be losing, that quality. So the correct growth stage is important, because it's going to produce your high value crop. And it's really the plant will appear to be just reaching its sort of optimum height. It will be starting to flower, and then once it's really not getting any taller, you'll see that the flower buds are there, and that's the time to go and mow. Mower type does have an effect on field losses, and I'm not sure how many rubber roller conditioners there are out there, but that can achieve the required stem damage and help it dry without causing too much damage to the leaf. So very often the steel tined conditioners create too much leaf damage, and subsequently, as the plant dries, we get leaf shatter and a lot of losses in the field. So it's a minimal amount of bruising to the stem to allow it to dry more quickly, but without all that leaf shatter, which will have the effect of lowering the crude protein available, because we're going to be leaving the leaf in the field. And then if we can leave it in the swath, you can see in the picture on the left there, we've got a nice, a nice sward. If the swath can sit on that, the air can flow through it, and it's going to help it. It dry down. So target dry matter around sort of 30%, 35% dry matter, and try and minimise those wilting losses. Avoid damage by cutting it too low, and also if it's wet, any heavy machinery will also cause damage to the crown. We should also say that, like most plants, if you allow it to flower once a year, it's going to be building up those root reserves. Right, I've got, I hope you can cope with this slide. It's heading date range, and it's relative to mixtures. So the red line down the middle is the 1st of June. And then as you move left of that red line, so, it's less 10 days, less 20 days, and so on. So 21st of March. And then the other side of the line, obviously, it's the dates in June. And the green block, the pale green block over the middle, represents the flowering time, the average flowering time for red clovers in the south, and then as you move to the north of the country. So we've got that sort of last week in May through to the first week in June is roughly when the red clover is flowering. Now, the dots on the graph, you can see the species of grasses that we would use in those mixtures. So at the top, we've got Italians. you can see their heading date range. So that's 50% ear emergence, don't forget, with grasses. You've got the heading date range of Italians, so they tend to head sort of end of the first 2 weeks and third week, the end of this second week in May, sorry, and the third week in May, as the Italians. You've got early perennials, which we'll disregard here completely. We've got hybrid ryegrasses, so a few of them will head a little bit later. We've got the intermediate heading group and the late perennial heading group there as well, and also we've got heading dates there for Timothy. So shorter term mixtures, traditionally these 2, maybe 3 year lays that contain Italian ryegrass, and maybe hybrids, and the 2 to 3 year red clovers. And you can see that very early in the year we'd get this Italian dominance, you know, the ryegrass dominance, and then it would flower. So the first cut was typically a lot of grass, and then the later cuts would be predominantly red clover, and they were difficult to manage. The Italian can tend to get stemmy, and the sward opens up in the bottom. So with the new, more persistent red clovers, we can now look at medium and longer term species of grass to include with that, so we get a much more even growth of grass along with the red clover in that sward. So the you know, the optimum blend now for mixtures that are going to last more than 3 years, so the 4 years plus, is very much the intermediate and late heading diploid and tetraploid group of perennial ryegrasses. I would also say that, you know, the higher sugar varieties of grasses are going to help complement the higher protein. They're going to help improve the fermentation process of that high protein silage. A few pitfalls where we've talked a little bit about the pest and diseases, and the answer for both of them has got to be rotations, and it's a 5-year break really, and if you've seen any problems out there, then you'd need to leave it for longer than that, and that's to avoid clover crash. Now, white clover can be used as a break crop, although really if you've got a red clover lay, you're trying to improve soil fertility, and you know, it's a nitrogen fixing lay for a crop that might have the best benefit from that, so you probably wouldn't be following it with a white clover lay. But you could do, if it was a livestock farm and you had no other crop, then, you know, a long-term lay with white clover wouldn't be a problem. But generally speaking, it's a crop that fits in a rotation with an arable, you know, an arable crop following on. Potentially. And then variety selection, well, obviously the varieties now, the plant breeding has massively improved varieties, and as I say, the more persistent varieties have a much greater tolerance to disease and stem nematode. Okay, so moving on to white clover. So generally it's grown in longer term lays with perennial ryegrass, but also in mixed swards with other grasses and other legumes and other herbs, as we've already said. Nitrogen fixing, we've got exactly the same numbers here as the red clover in the same way, and obviously white clover, you'd be familiar with the stoloniferous growth, which makes it a much improved grazing species compared to white clover. So predominantly in the longer term grazing lays that we're seeing white clover. Now, it's classified by leaf size, and when we say small leaved, we're talking about the leaf area range from sort of, well, it's around 450 millimeters, square millimeters for the leaf size, and up to the larger leaf, which is over 1500 millimeters in the, you know, the length and breadth of each leaf. So that's how they're classified. Generally, the smaller leaved are used for the more intensive grazing, perhaps on heavier soiled, and then typically the biggest group are the sort of the medium leaved, and that would be more for dual purpose lays, maybe cattle and sheep grazing. And obviously we've got larger leaved and we've got the very large leaved, and they're all listed on the recommended list by leaf size. Typically white clover will produce up to about 5 tons of dry matter in its second harvest year, and the recommended list now also has grass and clover swards, where they give you the yield and you know, as a sward containing ryegrasses and clover, and the typical yields of those are around 11.5 tons of dry matter in year 1. They're also measuring, interestingly, the clover percentage of those mixed sward. Typically the clover percentage of the mixed swards will be around 30 to 45%. So just to understand a little bit more about the actual plant and how it grows itself. So this is a picture of a young plant, and you can see the ball root there. which will eventually disappear. So the stolons are the horizontal stems that are running from left to right in the picture there. And once that plant's established, the growing point is the tip of that stolon. Okay, so that's quite susceptible to a sheep grabbing hold of it and pulling it out and eating it off potentially. The larger leaf varieties usually have longer petioles, or that's the stalk that the leaf's growing up from the stolon. All the way along that stolon, you'll see there's little nodes, and where those nodes touch the ground, they will throw down what we call an adventitious root, and that root will start to, grow into the soil, and it will produce nodules. And so that's how the plant goes on and grows, and how it becomes extremely persistent. So literally, a white clover plant can produce hundreds of stolons per square metre. So the growth curve of white clover is flatter than grass. So once it starts growing in the year, it keeps growing at a similar rate all season. Often sort of more of it in the summer, where we'd see a large peak followed by a lull with grass, and then a second peak with grass. So when we've got white clover in a grazing layer, as you can see, it can be easy to sort of tear off the stolons, but we've got plenty of adventitious roots and plenty of anchorage points to help that establish. Now, if you imagine when you're cutting that plant, so when we're grazing it, the animal is having a ripping effect, which, if it's hard grazing, it can, particularly some people say it can affect persistency with dairy grazing. It's hardest to get it last. So but if you want to improve the dominance of the clover, and that can also be an issue, mowing it, you can see if you're mowing that lay in say June, when it's really warm, the sunlight hits the ground, those stolons take off. And then what happens? The plant thinks, well, I don't need to put up this great big long leaf stalk anymore. I can get my leaf to the level it needs to be to get all the sunlight. So the tighter you cut that silage, or the lower you cut that hay, the shorter you will make the stem when it reappears on the clover. That's maybe a bit sort of black and white, but certainly we know that cutting into white clover, that can encourage clover dominance, and grazing tends to help us manage it a little bit easier. So there's a technique, an art to be learnt there into how to manage clover to avoid that white clover dominance that we can see. So increasing the yield and the cost saving potential of the modern clovers. So again, this is work that was done at IBERS quite a few years ago now. So they had a grass layer, they're putting 200 kilos of nitrogen a year on it. Over 3 years, it produced over 28 tons of dry matter, nearly 29 tons of dry matter. Another grass layer with some of the more traditional white clovers in, maybe some of the indigenous clover, produced 4 tons less basically. And then another grass lay where they were using the modern white clover produced another 4 tons. It produced a lot more dry matter over these 3 years than the grass and nitrogen. So yield advantage was over 4 tons. And then there was the cost saving. You got nitrum here at 150. That's a year or two ago, I'm sure you all know. But you've got the cost saving of the nitrogen over the 3 years as well. And obviously clover seed, probably around 20 quid a hectare at 2.5 kilos a hectare, something like that would be the price of the clover seed. So plenty of potential cost savings by using the modern clovers, and benefit of yield as well. I did a little idea on the red clover for you. This isn't quite such a good picture, but typically white clover has a shiny underneath. It's not hairy or furry. Flower head, although we tend to see red on the red flower, on the red clover, and white on the white, it's not always a particularly good indicator, because you can get very pale pink on red clover, and you can get sort of quite strong pink colours on the flowering head of a white clover. So the real clue is that sort of shiny underneath, as well as obviously if you can get down and have a look at the stolons. So just looking now at some of the characteristics of white clover. So high D value, typically comparing it with perennial ryegrass there. So 75 to 82 compared with 66 to say 75 on ryegrasses. Crude protein, it's high in crude protein, as we've already said, again comparing it with perennial ryegrass. The big thing is this dry matter intake potential. So it has this degradability that we were talking about earlier, which means it passes through the rumen more quickly and the animal can eat more of it. So typically dry matter intakes of legumes, in this case we've got white clover at 1.9 compared to 1.4, but typically the intake of legumes can be 20 to 30% higher with white clover compared to ryegrass. Also, it's higher in minerals, as you can see there, quite a bit higher in calcium, similar in magnesium, a little bit higher again in phosphorus and copper and selenium. So much higher mineral content on white clover. Now these are some results, some milk production trials and the effect of using white clover in dairy grazing swards over with cheggers, and the effect on milk and milk solid yields. So these are from Moore Park and Clonakilty's grazing experiments, where it's obviously the traditional spring block calving and rotational grazing management. So Moore Park, you can see grass only and 250 kgs of N applied, and grass with clover and again 250 kgs of N, or then in the case of Moore Park, you've got grass and clover and just 150 kgs of N. So, and that experiment, and also the work that was done at Clonakilty, where they got grass and clover with 250 and grass only with 250 kgs of N, both experiments have shown increases in milk yield and milk solids produced from the grass and white clover compared to the grass only swards. And even though the N application was dropping to 150, so the inclusion of clover increased the amount of dry matter produced, and the output was increased overall, reducing the input costs as well. So you can see there we've got an extra nearly 500 kilos of milk solids, and an increase of 30 kgs of, sorry, an increase of 500 kgs of milk yield and 30 kgs, over 30 kgs of milk solids at Moore Park, and 50 kgs of milk solids at Clonakilty, and another, what's that, over 600 litres, nearly 600 litres of milk from using, white clover in the sward. Establishment of white clover, well, I know time's going on, so I won't spend too much time, but very, very similar to white clover. Similar rules in terms of pH and P and K, and very versatile, should be fairly easy to establish, and direct drilling, broadcasting, whichever way we do it. We want a clean and weed-free layer as possible, and a nice fine and firm seed bed with minimal competition. If we're overseeding, we can also use animals and use the sort of the hoof and tooth method, so grazing it down very tightly, establishing the clover. You can see in the picture here the lay's actually been burnt off first, but that's the sort of drill that would be quite useful at introducing clover, provided that the sward was open enough. You might keep it grazed down and tread in the new seed, and then post sowing, be sort of on and off grazing for a few days. No nitrogen after we've sown the clover in the summer, to give the clover a chance to germinate and establish without the grass getting that hit of nitrogen and taking off again. And just maintain that grazing pressure until we can start to see the clover growing through it, and then we practice some on-off grazing to help get it established. The key thing really, again, similar soil temperatures, so that might be spring sowing, or it could be in June if we're over sowing, and then we can sow pretty well up to the end of August, and some years we'll get away with using white clover in swards even early in September. So again, I think this is very similar to to red clover in terms of pH, P and K, and nitrogen in the spring, only in low-end soils. Very shallow drilling is the rule. Please don't try and drill it too deep, especially when you think it's dry and you might be going after the moisture. It's got to be on the surface or very close to the surface, just in the top centimetre. Seed rates, around 2.5 kilos a hectare normally, but it might be increased up to around 4 in some instances. If people like a particularly dominant clover in the sward, that would be mixed usually with perennial ryegrass, and maybe one or two other grass species, maybe timothy as well, and things like that. And obviously we've already said really it's exactly the same in multi-species or various other lays for different purposes, including with red clover and chicory and plantain, perhaps herbs and other grasses as well. We talked a little bit about avoiding clover dominance while we're looking at the picture, didn't we? So when we're grazing, the rule of thumb to get that nitrogen fixation with white clover at over 150 kgs, we do need a clover content of around 30%. So what does 30% look like? Well, that's a very good question. And typically when we look at white clover and you stand over and over the sward and you look down, the flat leaf of the clover is looking up to you, looking up at you, if you like. So there's always around twice as much as you think there is. So in that top picture, you might look at that and think maybe that's 20% white clover, maybe a little bit more. If you were to cut it and do the separation between the two, the actual content would be half what it visually looks as if there is. So it's probably only around 10 or 15%. And the picture at the bottom there on the left, you know, that might look as if there's 50 or maybe 60% white clover. In reality, it's probably only 30%, 25 to 30%. So generally speaking, it's half what you think it is when you get your eye in and you start looking at the, you know, that leaf and then comparing what's really there. We've talked about managing bloat already, so I won't go on again. Coming towards the end now, just talking about some of the breeding. So I know a lot of breeding programs and the recommended list testing system concentrates very much on the above ground traits. So Germinal and IBAs, we're looking very much at the below ground traits. So in other words, the rooting system. And one of our recent projects, we were looking at white clover and Caucasian clover, so Trifolia repens and Trifolium ambiguum. So Caucasian clover, it's particularly resilient. It has, importantly, it has rhizomes as well as stolons. So we get these underground stems, and it can be very tolerant and resilient to hard grazing pressure. So we have, you know, we've bred a variety of that is a cross between the two. It's very cold tolerant, it's very pest tolerant, it's very drought tolerant as well. So that's sort of new. PUE is all about phosphate use efficiency. So we've been involved with a project looking at white clover that will establish and grow in low phosphate soils. So we've talked about the importance of phosphate at establishment, and typically there are a lot of low P soils around. They're not all low P, but they do exist, and obviously phosphate is quite it's a limited resource, it's a mined resource, and it's an expensive resource, it's an expensive input. So when we can produce varieties that will grow, and they're already now looking at these varieties that will grow in low P soils, that will be something of a breakthrough going forwards. And then also we're obviously looking at improving that early season growth, so that, you know, particular time when you're looking for it, when lambs and ewes are just being turned out, you've got clover in there then when you really need it. Red clover, it's working on that crown survival and persistency and improving grazing tolerance. Quality also, so continuing the protein quality and also working with the polyphenol oxidase. So we mentioned the PPO, high levels of PPO are good for protecting protein. We're also looking at low P varieties, low PPO varieties, so you get much rapid protein degradation and protein losses. Now those are going into silage swards, so they're managed for silage, and then the protein is extracted, so the protein is more readily available, and that protein is then fed back to monogastrics, so pigs and obviously poultry. It's not particularly for the ruminant sector, but potentially low PPO red clover varieties will be very important, maybe in arable rotations, to help improve soil fertility and soil structure, and at the same time it will give them a break crop to help manage blackgrass and things like that. So those are some of the things that Germinal and IBAs have been or are continuing to look at, but that's as well as all the you know, required agronomic traits that we need to achieve the recommended list status that we all, you know, plant breeders are also working for. So that should just lead us nicely into to Siwan and the recommended list. Siwan, thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. We'll whiz over to Siwan now.
Is that ready to go, Chloe?
I can see that, thank you.
Perfect. So good evening, everyone. And just to finish off tonight's presentation, I would just like to draw your attention to the recommended grass and clover list, which will only take about 5 minutes, and then we can get over to the questions. So the recommended grass and clover list, or the RGCL for England and Wales, are drawn up after rigorous testing for attributes such as yield, persistency, quality and disease resistance. All of this information is available in the list to help farmers compare different options available on the market. Since 2012, the scheme has changed and it's no longer partially funded by merchants, which means that the data is now available to all. The RGCL builds on information collected from national list testing and consists of additional 3 years' worth of testing. After this period, the recommended grass and clover crop committee decides if listed. What's key to remember here is that the variety must be better than what is already on the list to be listed. I know we're talking about clover tonight, but just to put things into perspective, as few as 1 in 20 ryegrasses tested make it to full recommendation on the recommended grass and clover list. Data for the RGCL is collected across 6 trial sites across England and Wales in areas of grassland production. Trial plots for each variety are grown outside across 4 of these sites. The remaining 2 sites, Barrenburg and Darrington, are only collecting disease data, which will be measuring the variety resistance to disease. Bringing the focus back to clover for tonight's webinar, the white clover trial plots include a seed rate of 3.5 kilograms a hectare for white clover varieties, along with 18 kilograms a hectare companion ryegrass. The red clover trials are sown at a seed rate of 13 kilograms per hectare as a monoculture. The performance of these plots are then compared to each other. White clover is cut on a monthly basis to assess yields, and more frequently in separate plots to assess persistence under stimulated grazing. Red clover is managed under a cutting management. The recommended grass and clover is produced in 2 guides, which you can see on your screen here, so the handbook and the merchant guide. The difference between the 2 is that the merchant guide provides the complete data set and useful for anyone wanting more detail. And I believe links to both these publications have been circulated in the chat box, but they're also available on the British Grassland Society website to download. So just for the next few slides, I'm going to just talk about the handbook. And on this page here, you can see that we are looking at the recommended list of white clover varieties, which is on page 18 of the handbook. The tables in the handbook contain data extracted from the complete data set and available to help farmers to check and formulate seed mixtures in conjunction with their merchant. You can see the content highlighted here in the red box on the top provides the various factors tested and compared for white clover. As Helen mentioned in her presentation, the leaf area is key for white clover, and you can see that we start at the top with the smallest leaf area, with Aber Ace there at 423 millimeters squared, and then we go down to Brianna at the bottom, which has the largest leaf area. Excuse me. The next column provides total yield of clover at 3rd harvest year, and in this column we are looking at the average equating to 100, which is just over 4 tons dry matter a hectare. The figures for each variety then provides a guide if the varieties are above or under this average total yield at 3rd harvest. Next in the row we have total yield of grass and clover, which gives an indication of how the grass and clover interact in terms of yield within the sward. The last 2 columns focus on autumn ground cover, either after light defoliation, which is estimating ground cover after cattle grazing, or hard defoliation, which would equal sheep grazing. This is provided on a 1 to 9 scale, with 1 being poor and 9 being good. Moving on to the list for the red clover, just so we've got plenty of time to go through your questions. This is available on page 19 of the handbook. And again, we've got the headings here highlighted in the red box. These are slightly different to what we see for the white clover. And you can see that the first one here is for the 1st harvest year, followed by total annual yield, crude protein percentage, in the first cut of the first harvest year, and then ground cover, which is shown here as a percentage. In the variety column, you will notice that a few of these varieties have an asterisk after their name, and this just indicates that these varieties are a tetraploid variety. So that was a quick whistle-stop tour on how you can use the recommended grass and clover list to help you pick your clover varieties. And to summarise, the main 3 steps to remember when picking your varieties is the first step is to decide what the mixture will be used for. So have a think, what is that lay going to deliver on your farm? Is that conservation or grazing? If grazing, what class of stock is it going to be grazed by? This is really important because individual varieties can perform better under silage than grazing management and vice versa. Step 2 is to have a look if the variety is on the list and then consider individual factors most important to your farm. And the final step is to discuss and refine with your merchant the mixtures to ensure that they will deliver for your needs identified in step 1. So on that, Chloe, I will hand back to you for questions.
Thanks very much, both Siwan and Helen. We do have lots of questions coming up. I'd just like to let everyone know that the recommended grass and clover list will be posted out with the Beef and Lamb summer bulletin and also All Things Dairy in July. But if you do need a hard copy sooner than that, then please let us know and we can get one in the post to you. So the first question is, Helen, how long between red clover crops would you overseed red clover into an existing red clover lay after, say, 3 years?
Well, I would only try and introduce new red clover plants if there was areas of the field where I didn't think the plant populations were good enough. You know, I can't stress enough the sort of attention to detail to get the right plant numbers to start with. And really, if the sward is already 3 years old, depending on what the red clover varieties are, it's probably time to give it a break rather than try and top it up. So if it's 3 years old, for example, it's probably not worth trying to top it up. I might actually think that, you know, okay, well, I've got some red clover plants, they're pretty good, but I wouldn't try and put more red clover plants. I'd probably think, well, I've got a lot of gaps. Why don't I try and put, you know, it might be sort of hybrids or intermediate tetraploid, depending, something else to give you a bit more ground cover, something else to just sort of bulk it up, just to last it. If you're trying to make it last for another year or two, I probably wouldn't be trying to put more red clover in. You know, you'd need to have a look, but it's going to depend on what's in there and what the conditions on the farm are, you know, and what's the chance of actually, you know, getting new plants established in there. But I probably wouldn't be thinking of topping it up with red clover.
Thanks, Helen. The next question is the DUP benefit in red clover the same for white clover?
I believe so, although I don't think it's quite as high in PPO. I think more mature white clovers are higher in PPO. I'm not sure that they're quite so high in the, you know, in a younger plant, but they certainly contain that you know, that ingredient. But I don't think it's comparable to red clover. There'll be a variation from variety to variety, and I wouldn't actually have all that data. I'd need to see, you know, if a plant breeder could give me that information.
Thank you. The next question is, Helen, there's a comment here that the clover leaf is probably quite tender. Is baling preferred or clamp silage?
I think the important thing is to, quite rightly you say that the leaf is tender. The important thing is to get the leaf into your system, and that means into the animal. So it doesn't really matter if if you've got good clamp management, it's perfectly acceptable to clamp it. You know, it's probably dry matter. If you're baling it, you might need to get it maybe a little bit drier, is a little bit more important. I think the thing is to be able to feed the red clover strategically. So sometimes you would put it in a clamp, in a sandwich with grass, and the actual true benefit of feeding that red clover can be lost because it's just a thin strip in the middle of a silage clamp. So if you've got it in a bale, you can feed it to the animals that you're really trying to feed that red clover to. So don't think it matters whether it's going in a bale or a clamp. It depends where you really want to feed that red clover silage at the end afterwards. And you know, even though if you get a lot of leaf shatter, you've still got the leaf in your farming system, but it's in the soil, and we're trying to get it in the animal. So it's that group of animals that you've identified you want to feed with that red clover. Are you going to be feeding them bales? Is it easier to get it into them in a bale, or you know, if it's just in a clamp on its own, then it's quite a small clamp. If it gets in a, you know, too big a clamp, it can get lost in a layer in the middle of grass where you won't see the actual nutritional benefits.
Thank you. And which is best, a metal tine conditioner or no conditioner?
Yeah, we didn't actually do that in that experiment. We didn't do no conditioner against a metal conditioner. We just know that the rubber one produced, so the stem on the red clover does need bruising, so you do need to bruise it gently to help it dry. It will depend upon the weather. I think you can get some tines that you can set them very loosely. I've never had to do this operation myself, so I don't know how you do it, but I believe you can really release the conditioning so it does a very, very minimal amount of damage. So if it's a damp time when you're trying to mow your silage, your red clover silage, you know, maybe very gentle steel tines, if there's no rubber roller conditioner available, might be better than none at all. If it's really hot, i.e. as in the weather that we've just been having, then potentially it will dry down quick enough without the need for any conditioning. It depends very much on the conditions, but I couldn't say yes, that one will be better than the other. You know, could be, you could finish it with it just being a little bit too waxy and a little bit too thick if you can't do a little bit of, put a little bit of bruising in onto that stem.
Thanks, Helen. And has any work been done in using white clover for weed suppression in permanent pasture? This person is trying to use it for suppressing creeping thistle.
I've never seen any trial work, but I know, you know, if you've got a healthy soil and good, you know, good P and K and a good pH, and you've got a good sward of both, I would say perennials are going to be the most aggressive. Then I'm not sure the white clover would actually suppress it, but a healthy sward is going to, with really good ground cover, is going to help outcompete the weeds. There was some work done a long time ago looking at the impact of soil fertility on weed content. I think it was at Bronid Mauer, and as they, you know, failed to manage the pH and the P and K levels, so the weed ingress got greater. So I just stress again that it's a good fertile, a good healthy soil, and you know, a good mixture of both, hopefully perennial ryegrass and white clover. I wouldn't say it would, you know, it depends a little bit on the creeping thistle, whether it's could ever actually completely outcompete it. It depend on you know, on the thistle, on the volume of thistle. And there's a time to mow them, isn't there? May's too soon, July the shore to die, isn't it? And managing creeping thistle. There's a time to mow them that will help you control your creeping thistle.
Thanks, Helen. We've got a question here. They got a bit lost on leaf size. Can you clarify what you mean with rotational grazing compared to intensive grazing? What did you mean the difference between those two?
Yeah, well, I think when rotational grazing, I was really sort of talking about block carving and you know, spring block carving and the typical dairy rotational grazing. Intensive grazing, in this instance, I was talking more about really very heavy grazing with sheep, which may or may not be rotational grazing, you know, or block grazing. It's just intensive sheep pressure at a different time of the year.
Thanks, Helen. We've had this question for both red and white clover. How can you stop the percentage of clover in a sward dominating the grass?
So red clover, well, you know, you really want quite a dominant red clover plant. We're growing it mainly for silage. It is about getting a balanced mixture if it's red clover and getting the right species of grasses in there to help compete with the red clover. Well, not compete with the red clover, but complement the red clover, I should say, throughout the year. White clover grazing tends to help us reduce the dominance of white clover. So we see typically in you know, rotational grazing with dairy cows that after sort of 4 or 5 years, maybe the white clover would start to die out. And if we're mowing it, if we start to mow it, particularly in the June, because of the effect, you know, the grass has already slowed down a little bit in June, and then you cut it right off, and it takes a while to put that new leaf on. So when we're grazing with grass and clover swards, there's a little bit of leaf left behind, so the regrowth on the grass is quicker. When we mow grass, we cut into it, and we tend to cut quite low, and it takes longer for the grass to put leaf back on, and at the same time we're opening the sward for the white clover stolons to take off, and the white clover's got an opportunity to put up a much shorter leaf stalk. So it's a very fine art between balancing grazing and mowing. So mowing is going to encourage dominance, and grazing will help you control that white clover. If you do get dominance, the time to try and introduce grass is probably March, is very early in the year when the clover content is low. So you can try and stitch more grass species in then, and that might help you by putting more grass in at a time of year when the clover isn't growing particularly you know, aggressively.
Thanks, Helen. And are there any instances of the high copper levels in white clover causing problems in susceptible sheep breeds?
I've heard it talked about from, I think, New Zealand. I've not come across it over here personally. That might be a question we could defer to somebody else. If we take that question, we can perhaps bring you an answer. It's not something I've come across, although I've got a vague recollection somewhere at the back of my mind that I've heard Kiwis talking about it, and yeah, so I'm not saying no, but I'd need to come back to you on that one.
Okay, thank you. I've got another question here. Considering the dietary preferences of sheep for red clover, chicory and plantain, is it preferable to sow these as separate swards for lambs finishing, as in a mixture it can be difficult to graze to the correct sward height to suit all three species?
Sure. Well, I think your problems by growing them all as straight stands, if they're in very small areas or just small parts of a field, then obviously, you know, they go and select which bit of the field. But if you've got just a pure monoculture of red clover, your ground cover's not going to be very good in there, and likewise maybe with chicory. So, you know, the red clover and the chicory, there's going to be very little winter growth. So I think that the sum of the parts are what makes it, you know, the individual characteristics are fantastic, but putting them all together, my view is that it would give you more to give it to them, you know, to have them all mixed together. We can improve the ground cover and the, you know, the growth pattern of the different species if we blend the mixtures correctly. The idea is that they actually complement each other, rather than, you know, if you've got just red clover or just white clover or just chicory, at some point in the year there will be no growth in there. If that's what you want, you know, that's fine, but there'd be, you know, it might be easier to manage as part of a mixture, as a blend.
Thanks. And are there any circumstances where you would add white and red clover in the same seed mixture?
Traditionally we didn't, although I think a long while ago they used to, but we certainly do now. So my sort of argument against it 10-15 years ago would have been that, well, you know, your red clover will die out, and when it dies out, you know, you're going to have a gap, and something will fill the gap. Hopefully it'll be the grass tillering out or the white clover, but that's not always the case. So but sort of more recently, in the last sort of 5 or 8 years, we've started including about 1 kilo in a long-term grazing lay of red clover, and we can do that if farmers want that. But you've just got to make sure that, you know, if and when the red clover does start to die out, that you've got enough of your preferred species, sown species, so your white clover, you know, they're already filling the gaps up, and that you don't get you know, you don't get a hole that throws your thistle or your dock up for you. And obviously, if you've got red clover in that sward, I think it's a nice addition. You've got to remember that, you know, you can't flush ewes in that field, or maybe they wouldn't eat enough of it to cause a problem, but it wouldn't almost be worth the risk to use that field for grazing ewes.
Thank you. Helen, do you have any tips on overseeding white clover in an area where it's light sandy loam in a low rainfall area? What are your thoughts on sowing it in drought conditions? Will the seed wait until the rain comes?
Yeah, I mean, clovers that they are quite hard coated seeds, so they don't you know, they do last pretty well in soil. But I think I'd rather wait and know that we're going to get a shower. So when, you know, reading the weather forecast, it would be you know, get it grazed down, be ready to have it as tight as you can possibly get it, and make sure you've got plenty of access to the soil with those seeds, and just incorporate them lightly in the surface, and hopefully, you know, you'll get the rain to do it. But they must be on the surface. You know, it's no good putting them any deeper. But white clover should establish well, generally speaking, in that sort of those sorts of conditions. You know, it likes light, dry land. You know, that shouldn't really be a problem, provided you can get that seed to soil contact.
Thank you. And what are the typical germination rates for clover? So if you need 200 plants per square metre for red clover, how many seeds need to be sown?
Or generally the germ, and I mean, we do run germ tests. I forget what actually the standards are, but the germ will be around sort of, you know, 90%, probably more. Sometimes it might be just slightly less, but you would always expect it to be very high. And obviously you're buying seed from a reputable merchant, you know, with properly tested and you know, with all the information backing up the seed production of those different varieties, those different species, whatever species you're using, I would say. So typically it might be about 90%, but when we grow anything like that, we're going, not only, it's not just that they don't germinate or establish, it's that, you know, one falls on the stony ground, the crow gets one, the slug gets another. So, you know, there's always a small percentage of the plants that don't quite make it through to the following year. It's not because they didn't establish, it's not because they didn't germinate. There's other things that are going on that can mean they don't survive. But I mean, similarly with grass, you know, for you know, reseeding in livestock farms, we use quite high seed rates compared to the actual number of plants that we're looking for at the end of, you know, the following year. So there's always this small percentage that that don't quite make it through into a full season. But it's not necessarily down to the germ of the plant when it's actually drilled.
Thank you. We've got a comment here that in the north of the country, clover growth and nitrogen fixation tends to be slow in the spring, and so it can impact first cut yields. Any tips to reassure this person in these conditions?
The slow clover growth, well, select modern varieties is the first thing I'd say, and it is something that I know Germinal plant breeders are very much looking to improve the spring growth of white clover, and it is a key area. It is dependent a little bit on, you know, your soil temperature and your outlook and your soil type. So we're working on it, and I think, you know, the modern varieties and younger layers are going to produce better spring growth for you. If that's
Thanks, Helen.
That's what you can use.
What is the best clover safe chemical to use in controlling docks? And another question is, what is the best timing with clover to apply a herbicide?
Okay, so there's several clover safe sprays, not that many for reseeds. I haven't been selling chemicals for quite a few years now, so I don't want to use the name, but the clover safe, the actual chemical rather than the product name, would be 2,4-DB, which I think it was in no, I can't remember, and I think there are some sulfonyl ureas that they use as well, or something like that. But the key thing to controlling docks where you've got clovers is growth stage. So this is in an existing sward. It's important that the docks are at exactly the right stage. And what I would say in your older lays, when you're trying to control docks, it's a war of attrition. It's not something that, you know, it's not a one-hit wonder to try and control the dock. So it's the optimum growth stage for the docks. It's the optimum time when the temperature and the weather's absolutely right to get a really good kill with the appropriate chemical. And then in younger lays, when it's reseed and we're trying to take out or not maybe so much annual weeds, we might control those through, you know, either grazing or mowing or topping. But if it's perennial weeds, in seedling perennial weeds in reseeds, timing is absolutely everything. And we talk about the two leaf stage. So the first leaves you'll see as the plant germinates are the cotyledons. The next 2 leaves are the true leaves, and that is the point at which the chemical must be applied to actually kill them. Obviously, your grass and your clover need to be, your clover's got to be past its trifoliate leaf, and the grass needs to be tillering. But to have an effective kill, the weeds need to be very, very small. So timing is everything. By the time you see them, if you're not careful, they're 2 inches high, which is probably a long way past the 2 leaf stage. I think there's a product called, I think it's called, I don't want to say any names, but I think there's one called Clover Max, which might be effective for reseeds. But I'm sure, you know, again, that's information that we can share with, you know, the appropriate advice. We can come back on that.
Thanks, Helen. We have just got a few more questions, if that's okay. I think we'll get back to a lot of people by email as we are running out of time tonight. So Helen, we've got one here. How will moving away from a 21 to 28 day grazing rotation towards the 35 to 60 day rotation affect white clover persistence, and will that be detrimental?
I couldn't see that would be detrimental. It might be, and this might be what you're looking to achieve, but I would imagine if you're defoliating hard every 3 or 4 weeks, and then you're going to start defoliating the clover at 5 or 6 weeks, potentially you'd have a lot more clover and a lot more leaf, and I would imagine that you'd be doing less damage to the clover. The only consideration might be whether the grass is getting in the way of the clover, or whether the clover's out competing the grass. But if you're trying to get more clover in the sward, then perhaps that is the way to do it. To so you graze it, and that the clover's got a much longer time to recover, to carry on putting its stolons and more adventitious root out, and therefore throw out more leaf. So I would imagine it would probably encourage the clover, but I can't say I've ever seen anybody change from one to the other and remark particularly on the difference.
Thanks, Helen. And are there any implications with using slurry on clover swards as a nitrogen source?
No, not really. I mean, they should be fixing nitrogen for you, but slurry would be, perhaps more usable, and obviously cheaper. If you've got slurry, you've got to use it. So there shouldn't really be any implications in terms of of nitrogen. Sorry. If anything, I'd sort of describe it as if you're feeding it nitrogen and there's nitrate there, it's almost like, so your clover's got this little factory where it can make nitrate for you. And if you give it nitrate, the plant just becomes lazy, if you like. It doesn't have to, so what you're trying to do always is achieve a system whereby, the plant's using its own resources to produce that nitrogen. So a lot of people would on legumes, particularly things like lucerne and purer stands of red clover, will try not to use any N at all if they can. But that's not practical in our situation. Over here we've got a lot of dairy slurry, and the ideal place for it is on these swards. The only thing to probably say is whether we're using injectors or trailing shoe. So both can obviously cause a little bit of damage at ground level, whether that's ripping into stolons. If it's a well-established white clover, that might not be too much of an issue. It can recover. If it's on red clover, that trailing shore injector could potentially be damaging the crown. So probably dribble bars are the best, where you're putting it as close to the soil as you can. It's not going on any leaf or very little leaf, and the nutrients are hitting the ground where they're going to be used, and you're going to lose a lot less nutrients to the atmosphere or whatever. So that would probably be the best way to do it if that's possible. But no, I think we, it's an obvious place to use slurry on any kind of legume or clover swards, whatever the clover might be.
Thanks, Helen. And the last question is, would you put an application of nitrogen on after you've cut red clover for silage, or would a P&K fertiliser be better for grazing the aftermaths?
P&K every time.
Thank you. So thank you everybody for your questions this evening. We have been inundated with questions, and Siwan and I will work through those in the next week or so and get back to you all, and apologies we haven't been able to get through them all this evening. Thank you very much, Helen and Siwan, for your time this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for asking us.
Thank you everyone at home for listening, and please do get in touch if you've got any further queries. The presentation and questions have been recorded and they'll be available on the AHDB YouTube channels along with other previous webinars. So thanks again and have a good evening everyone.
Thank you.